the international law as we understood in terms of its potential, in terms of its vitality, has been badly bruised. And now we see a situation where the US government, that was traditionally associated with standards of human rights, standards of upholding rule of law at a global and domestic levels, and international lawyers from the United States were always in the lead to negotiate international treaties and conventions. That very country.
As a breakdown of the international order, but if you look at, it's generally a very recent order, right? It's post-Westphalia when you have, nation states coming out of Europe and these rules, both customary and treaty laws developing. But in that particular context, I don't think it's that extraordinary. You've had these international organizations fail earlier as well. The League of Nations is an example.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Oves Anwar, your host for Legally Speaking. As the name suggests, we'll be discussing the law, but beyond the headlines and the courtroom, to unpack how the law actually shapes our lives. From landmark judgments and constitutional questions, to international treaties, regional disputes, and the rules that govern everyday life. We try to make sense of a system that affects all of us, whether we realize it or not. Each week, we'll be examining how legal principles translate into real-world consequences for nations, governments, institutions, businesses, and importantly, you and I as individuals. We look at what the law says, how it is applied, where it falls short, and what it means for your rights and responsibilities. So if you've ever wondered not just what happened, but whether it was lawful, justified, or fair, you're in the right place, legally speaking. So without much further ado, let's start with this week's discussion. Earlier, I was joined by two guests, Mr. Ahmer Bilal Soofi, President of the Research Society of International Law, and Professor Sikander Ahmed Shah, who's Professor of International Law at LUMS University, to discuss the state of international law today. With US President Donald Trump capturing President Maduro of Venezuela, eyeing the sovereign territory of Greenland to annex, and giving Benjamin Netanyahu a clean sheet, all doesn't fare well for international law today. So with this background, let's go to our guests to better understand the state of international law today. US President Donald Trump's recent actions, whether it was the capture and subsequent trial of Venezuelan President Maduro, or eyeing Greenland and its sovereign territory, what we see here is a serious threat to international law. And at the same time, we also see President Trump basically giving a clean sheet to Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been, potently accused of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So what do we make out of all of this? To better understand this, I'm delighted to have with me Mr. Ahmer Bilal Soofi. He is advocate of the Supreme Court of Pakistan, as well as President of the Research Society of International Law. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Abbas.
So I wanted to begin by asking you, what do you make of these recent actions of the Trump regime, the Trump administration, acting which would seem very contrary to international law and what the basic tenets of international law are? What do you make of this, sir?
I think it's an extraordinary development in our times, right before our eyes. The international law as we understood in terms of its potential, in terms of its vitality, has been badly bruised. And now we see a situation where the US government, that was traditionally associated with standards of human rights, standards of upholding rule of law at a global and domestic levels, and international lawyers from the United States were always in the lead to negotiate international treaties and conventions. That very country is choosing to make declarations that it will attack other countries. It will occupy territory, let's say in Greenland. In Venezuela, we just noticed that such an action did actually take place, despite the fact that it was violating international law. And now there's a threat posed to Canada, of all the countries next door. There's a threat posed to Iran. There's a threat posed to several other countries. So I think what is really happening is a complete disregard of the norm of international law, making the institution of United Nations less effective. But I still believe that norm, despite being hurt or bruised, is still intact. And if you notice the way the entire global community has reacted unanimously, it is on the strength of this norm of non interference, of political independence, which has been codified in the UN Charter, particularly in Article 2. It was also thought at some point in time that US has the power or the political capacity to exercise hegemonic control or hegemonic interest in its hemisphere. This was primarily based on the Monroe Doctrine of 1820s.
Absolutely.
But some of the lawyers, when 1945 UN Charter came into existence, a lot of international lawyers were of the view that now Monroe Doctrines should be discarded because it is in conflict with the UN Charter itself.
Absolutely.
So whatever you have politically aimed at through a Monroe framework has now been placed under serious limitation of the Charter itself in 1945. This seems to be a reversal now from the UN Charter limitations going back to the Monroe Doctrine. And of course, unilateralism is the word, if I were to summarize it from an international law standpoint, that there is now a very clear position of the Trump administration, and let's clarify this. Trump administration may be thinking differently from the Congress. Trump administration may be thinking differently from the State Department, from the legal advisory office, and so on. So that's where we are. So I would summarize in response to your question that international law is down but not out.
All right, that's good to hear. So we'll be discussing this, but I just wanted very briefly to ask you, the UN Charter, you mentioned that, and it lays out a scheme of sovereign states, equality between these states, and non-interference. Could you explain what the basic essence of that is, sir?
Well, historically, if you remember, we all have been students of history, and we study about empires occupying title, territory, one after another. So during, before 1945 and backwards in time, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, the legitimate mode to acquire territory was always occupation, aggression. It
Conquest.
was a perfect conquest. It was perfectly legitimate that you could conquer a territory, put your flag on the fort, and now declare the title. This is mine. And that is how it used to be done. But there was a cost to all this, and to this bloodshed and this invasions, and there was no serious development. Everyone was worried who will be the next entity attacking. So people were looking, behind their shoulder to see, and constantly the entire focus of the human race was focused on military equipment and military planning and so on. When 1945 Charter basically said, stop, we will now onwards not attack each other. We will accord sanctity to the international boundaries, howsoever they have come into existence, except two areas, of course, Kashmir and Palestine, where the controversy continued. But other than that, all boundaries, howsoever sketched, drawn, or demarcated on ground in Africa, in South Asia, and other parts of the world, attained finality. Now, this attaining of finality was simultaneously rhyming with understanding that now war has become unlawful. We will not resort to war. So even the terminology became obsolete.
I see.
So you wouldn't even use the word war after 1945. And if you were to use that, you were actually committing to illegality. So if you remember, the Department of War as it existed before 1945 UN Charter in the US administration was then renamed as Department of Defense, because you could use force after 1945 only in defense.
I see.
Only in self-defense. So to comply with the legal commitment under the Charter, the Department of War in US was renamed as Department of Defense.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And interestingly, now we see an attempt by Pete Hegseth, who's the current Secretary of Defense, but he wants to be called the Secretary of War, and rename this.
Exactly. So when they renamed that, as a person who has taken interest in international law development, and I use those developments as a benchmark to assess which way foreign policy intends to go. So I felt alerted.
I see.
I felt, to me, it was a clear sign, and this was done last year, some months ago, when they said, we want to now rename Department of Defense as Department of War.
Yeah.
So, bringing back a terminology which was obsolete, which was done and dusted, and say we would like to rename our department meant that use of force now was very much on the table, on the cards. So that's how I think this is the direction that the foreign policy of the Trump administration is going.
And it's very interesting because at the same time, Pete Hegseth also was promoting a new rules of engagement, if you will. And I think the term he used was maximum lethality. Right? And we know that under IHL or under the use of force, that is not the approach that you want to take.
You've been a pioneer in heading the conflict
Law
center in RSIL and done so much of work, and you and your team are absolutely familiar about the IHL framework is applicable in peacetime by virtue of Common Article 3 and even otherwise. The use of force has to be extremely proportionate, carefully calibrated in terms of response and so on. Now, complete disregard of all that. And one notices also that within the state, one is the assessment as to use of force by the US Trump administration, which way is going at an external level. But internally as well, the war powers are traditionally vested in the Congress,
Absolutely.
in the Senate, and they are supposed to authorize. So it's going to be, a lot of questions are being raised on that account as well.
Absolutely. I mean, within the U.S., the constitutionality of this particular, attempts, whether it's capturing a sitting president of a foreign country or whether it's taking, Greenland by force, if you will, though we do see quite a bit of, I think, opposition coming about from specifically the Greenland issue. Within the U.S., we've had a visit by U.S. Officials to, I think, some European capitals just to assure them that, this is something that we are not on board with, right? At the same time, Europeans are genuinely worried about this, right? And I think they've sent troops even just as a show of, though I don't think that there's any equivalence in terms of military balance between the Europeans and the Americans, but they've sent troops to Greenland to show that their solidarity behind this. But sir, this leads to another question. If an attempt is made, right, and nothing is beyond the pale of reality anymore, if an attempt is made, this would have a very serious impact on NATO. Because NATO's underlying foundation is an attack on one state, is an attack on all of us. But this is an attack on one state from within. What do you think would be the future of NATO then?
I see, if the current foreign policy continues, I see a meltdown in NATO.
Okay, well.
I think NATO is on its way to, it might become extinct.
Wow.
For the way it's going. I mean, the speed with which it is going. Mm-hmm. The statements after statements being matched correspondingly by European leaders. You can see the intense way in which the whole debate is proceeding, and US government is saying we really have no regard for whether NATO stays or not. Wow. And as one of the European leaders said, so should we close your bases and ask you to take your nuclear weapons? I mean, that's a very serious issue. You have the nuclear weapons in possession of the NATO members, and still you are choosing to create an annoyance within the NATO community, and absolutely confident about that. So this shows that as some of the administration people or those who sympathize with them are of the view that even if NATO goes, doesn't matter because we are footing the bill, so why should we bother in a long-term sense? That's how they're looking at it. So it's not merely Greenland, it is also bringing to a very clear, conclusion to the NATO and its forces and expenses that the US may have in relation to NATO matters.
Absolutely, and it's very interesting because when we see the UN Charter, we see this concept of
regional arrangements, and
collective self-defense.
Yes.
Absolutely, sir. And the real epitome of this has been NATO, right? It's been the prototype. It's been the what we really understand as collective self-defense.
And I tell you, Oves, there might be international lawyers in French ministry and the German ministry and UK Home Office who must be struggling to figure out that if one of the NATO members, walks in the opposite direction to the treaty itself, is he still a member? And then will this treaty be viewed as treaty amongst the remaining members, or thus will we view it as a treaty which stands melted down, so we'll have to rearrange ourselves? So it could be a very interesting proposition that how would they view the collective arrangement that they have, stitched together through a treaty arrangement. Is that now coming to an end? Or can it coexist minus US amongst the existing members? So this could be another legal point of interpretation.
Absolutely. No, I think it'd be a very interesting thing. Can there be a NATO minus the US, or can there be an European Union plus a military angle to it as well?
Right.
Because so far it's only been an economic or immigration-related mechanism. So I wanted to again come back to this point. We have seen the global rules-based order after the Second World War really being underwritten or supported by Western governments. And it's at the same time that we're now seeing the Western governments pull back from this, whether it was during the Gaza, genocide that was being committed over there, the atrocities being committed there, and what we expected was some sort of criticism of the Israeli government. That was not forthcoming, neither by Europeans, though some did, and nor by the Americans. So I think that was the first step. Now we're seeing, a far greater threat, perhaps, to the essence of international law. Do you feel that with the Europeans and maybe the Americans stepping back, that international law will collapse? Or do you feel that there might be another party, maybe the Chinese or maybe someone else, who will step into that vacuum that is created?
Wes, before I answer specifically this, let me tell you that the whole idea of not using force, not going for aggression or declaring war illegal is not a creation of those who drafted the UN Charter.
Okay.
It represents a civilizational maturity of several civilizations.
Absolutely.
Chinese, Russians, Islamic, English, American, whosoever. Everyone suffered over a period of time through war. So there was the collective subconscious was, we should find a way out of this. Let's have a peaceful setting. Let's have bilateral relations, multilateral frameworks. Let's focus on science, technology, excellence, and so on. So this civilizational maturity is now at stake. So there was a not merely legal instrument that was being crafted. It was a gradual realization that all people of the world, the human race, has achieved a certain degree of maturity where they chose to say, we will not fight with each other unless there's a just cause. So, and let's write it down, and then the treaty earlier, and then the UN Charter, and so on. So the concern is, are we going to lose this civilizational maturity that we have arrived at?
I see.
So I think if, God forbid, the international legal order collapses or begins to collapse, then the fallback will be on these civilizations and their values and what those values are based on and how do they want to stand up. So, for example, the Chinese talk about the shared future. Confucius philosophy, and based on that, they haven't been going into attack mode as much as any other country. Russians are similarly have a long history of so many customary norms and so on. The OIC countries collectively have a very rich history of conducting wars, of treatment of various belligerents and so on, and apart from that, upholding the international treaty frameworks and governance that you enter into. So I think there's a safety net of various civilizations' values which is still existing. I don't think that international law will completely collapse. I think it will reinvent itself, perhaps, as you said, through an alternative bodies like SCO and so on. And I'm reminded of, I think it's 2016, before Trump entered appearance as a president, that China and Russia, they together issued a joint declaration on international law. I found that very interesting. Again, as a lawyer who's following on developments, why Russia and China are thinking of creating a legal niche, a legal island, a legal framework, which is separate from the UN Charter, although the aims broadly are aligned. So if you pick up the SCO Charter, there's not much difference with what the UN Charter and its objectives talk about. If you pick up SCO treaty framework and other things that they have documented and they have brought in forums that they have created, again, normatively not very different from the UN Charter. They are not offending, they are not curtailing, they are not sidelining the UN Charter itself. In fact, reinforcing, but through a separate forum. So the norm continues to be the same. The forums may change. So I think when this 2016 declaration came out, I thought they are beginning to read the foreign policy of the US government as going outside the UN Charter framework. And lo and behold, that's 10 years on, that's exactly where we are, that the foreign policy led by President Trump is now going into all sorts of directions that we are looking at.
And so do you feel that this is also a direction that when we're going to see other states now going, because we've seen, actions by, say, India when it tried to attack Pakistan. We saw actions by a number of other states, Israel in particular, attacking 7 or 8 countries in the region, Iran specifically, and a number of others. So do we see, extra UN Charter or extra legal, I would say, measures being taken there?
I think, again, there is a context to it. And unfortunately, it's a religious context. In these three, you pick up the Hindu ideology and their beliefs and their aspirations, you will clearly find that we would like to go back to India as it was, united the entire subcontinent.
So you're referring to the BJP Hindutva ideology
framework. And now we have one of the senior people saying that we have to avenge history. So the underlying motivation is not legal, is not equality of state. It's completely ultra vires the charter and the modern international law. So you're relying. Israel likewise, again, unfortunately, is relying on a religious narrative and saying that we had a promised land and therefore the promised land means from this river to that river, so which effectively means a plan to occupy surrounding states, which include several states that are at the moment independent.
Absolutely.
President Trump's aides also are telling they are inspired by evangelists and so on and so forth. And one reason that some of them cite to support Israel is actually a religious reason rather than... So there's an undercurrent of religious sentiment in the foreign policy of these countries, which was coexisting separately while the unilateral framework has come in. Now, the question was, will they be emboldened to do this and think of doing that? Yes, the answer is yes.
Okay.
And that is why I think suddenly there is an urgency for alliances. There's an urgency, bloc politics, Canadian Prime Minister going to China. And if you notice the way he expressed himself was amazing, the way he said that yes, this is a new international order. He gave pauses, driving home the point very clearly. We also have alliances in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely.
Suddenly the Middle Eastern countries felt unnerved.
The Turks are thinking of joining it, which was unheard of.
Which is unheard of, which is going to be remarkable. But you see, they are being compelled to do that. It's not voluntary engagements. I mean, we were there for the last 70 years, but nobody thought of doing that. So now they have been pushed and they are finding, they have to find solutions and remake the alliances. And I think EU leaders are also saying that we need to rethink alliances, which literally means why shouldn't we talk to Russians and why shouldn't we talk to China? So I think these alliances will be the counterforce in the realpolitik domain to any expansionist designs that India or other countries may have in the region. And lucky for us, last May we had a military victory, which was globally recognized. So that has given us, some additional, I would say, impetus to perhaps lead the region, not in an entire sense, but considerably be a major player of the region.
Mr. Soofi, one particular issue that I found, which really, I think, changed the dynamics when it came to international law, especially for the Global South, I think, was the Palestine issue. The way these atrocities took place. Why do you feel Palestine was particularly fatal or particularly damaging to the international rules-based order or to international law as it stands today?
Well, we have to treat it as an exception to a general rule-based order. Otherwise, you will make the entire legal order sink with it. It's a great failure of entire human race. It is a great failure of civilizational values. Law comes later. International law comes later. And of course, the treaties and Geneva Conventions and law occupying, whatsoever we have read as law students onwards, and there are verdicts on that. Not that it's my opinion or you as a VAS is saying that or somebody else is saying that. International Court of Justice, as credible forums like International Court of Justice, making a very clear categorical declaration that there is an issue of title. It doesn't have a title. It has to be treated as an occupier in West Bank, in Gaza, and so on. The construction of the wall is absolutely against international law.
Absolutely.
So these verdicts have been coming consistently up to this point, where even this atrocity in the last couple of years that we noticed, the shocking atrocities that we noticed, where individual responsibilities have been created, and no one doubts that there will be a war crime charge and international wherever this happens. So I would treat it as an exception, where the real politic steps in and says, stop the use of law, we will do what we feel like doing. Now, then they have to respond to what we call the conscience of the world, and their conscience as well. Those who wish to find a solution to Palestine, or it's a great failure, frankly, that we could not prevent it from happening.
Absolutely.
No country could prevent it from happening.
Or within the 2 years, the 2 years plus that it took, and even now, we're still not able to.
We're not been able to. Although, I mean, the Genocide Convention actually creates an obligation to intervene.
Wow.
The Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, the
Absolutely.
state parties to the convention have a duty to prevent. So the duty to prevent is a general duty cast, which means you can deploy any means and measures, whether it's a boycott, whether it's a pressure tactics, whether it's diplomatic persuasion, or necessary countermeasures should you want to do that. And everyone did not perform the obligation that they had signed.
The collective failure.
Collective failure. Absolutely. So it's very unfortunate, and that remains a mark of failing of international law. But as I said, there are issues like Kashmir, again, is a failing venue of international law, that you have UN resolutions. So while the norm of self-determination is very much there, the forum thought it is weak enough not to enforce it against India. So despite so many resolutions on Kashmir, how it should be resolved. And then India moves ahead, feels emboldened, they decide that they have to take over and completely absorb the title and completely claim the title of the special status that it was enjoying under its control.
So they move from occupation to annexation.
Annexation.
And annexation under international law is completely
unlawful.
Unlawful.
But they tried to create a justification of that. So if you look at it, they tried to create justifications on the executive side, on the legislative side, on the judicial side. So all three organs of any state, they created a justification for that. So in the legislative side, they issue a presidential order.
Yes.
20 pages plus, you've gone through that. And then on the executive side, they decided to have an infrastructure whereby the voting pattern was changed, whereby
they bifurcated,
and then governor importation and the change in the maps and so on. And on the judicial side, we know that Article 370s, as you say, hollowing out was challenged before the Supreme Court of India, and they just endorsed it. And if you look at this judgment, not even a mention of the Kashmir resolutions, not even a mention. So how can you decide a case, a list before you, while disregarding the applicable law which is integral to that proposition? That's so elementary. Any judge is supposed to first take stock of.
Absolutely.
That this is the applicable law. Now I have to carve out solution for the petitioner or the respondent, as the case may be. But here they completely disregard it. That there is no. We're just talking about our own constitution and stop with that. Although that constitution refers to Kashmir and so on and so forth. And then there were judgments of the Supreme Court of India. There were judgments of the High Courts of India, where they have argued that complete sovereignty has not been shifted to Indian Union. Kashmir state retains some element of sovereignty and hence entitled to use flag and so on. But this judgment completely
and this is despite accepting India's general position that it has rights towards this. Despite all that, they're saying that sovereignty hasn't fully been merged.
Despite the fact that they had a strong position that Kashmir is ours, the one that we occupy, we control, the Supreme Court found at the independent benches, I think it was 1970s, and another judgment came then. These judgments were followed, and they found out, they looked at all these documentation, instrument of accession, subsequent correspondence, resolutions, presidential orders, and everything under the Constitution of Union of India, and they came to this conclusion: no, it is not. We can't absorb it.
I see. Very
so
interesting.
Some element of sovereignty is still with them. So, and that is why the Flag Act and so on and so forth. But now they said it's ours. Not only that, they have now exaggerated the claim in a legal sense to say GB has to come to us, AJK has to come to us, even Ladakh and the territory that China has with them, they claim that, which is completely against international law.
Absolutely. So now, I mean, you've come to Kashmir, and I think this. I really want to discuss what Pakistan as a middle power. How do we navigate, a world where international law or things that we used to assume were, standard elements of the scenery, right? They were part of the background, and we accepted that this is how it's going to be. All of that is changing, right? The fundamentals are changing.
Let's use this metaphor. I mean, there's part of the scenery. One big tree has fallen, but the remaining scenery is very much there.
Okay.
The flowers, the beds, the grass, the ecosystem exists. So multiple hundreds and thousands of treaties that exist amongst the state, they're not evaporating.
They're not all in flux.
They're not in flux. They're very much intact. And I think every country is going to measure their conduct with reference to what they have ratified and agreed.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to have with me Professor Sikander Shah. Sikander Shah is a professor of international law at LUMS University. Welcome.
Thank you. Yes.
Sikander, I wanted to begin by asking you, how severe a threat do we see the Trump administration or recent events really to the foundation of international law and really the global rules-based order?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, some people see this as a breakdown of the international order, but if you look at, it's generally a very recent order, right? I mean, it's post-Westphalia when you have, nation states coming out of Europe and these rules, both customary and treaty laws developing. But in that particular context, I don't think it's that extraordinary. You've had these international organizations fail earlier as well. The League of Nations is an example when basically some of these major powers didn't become invested in those organizations. And so if you look at that trajectory, you'll see that the current global order is coming out of World War II. And that's where countries like the victorious powers invested heavily in this order. The Americans, as you know, have the US has effectively disproportionately funded the UN system, and that was their sort of this liberal multilateral order that they were pushing. And for reasons that we can discuss, they are stepping back, and I don't think that Trump's appearance is an anomaly because that's coming out of local conditions, leading to him winning not once, twice. So in a way, this is something which is not extraordinary. Whether this means that this particular order fades away and you have another order, threats to that order has always been there, right? Whether it's coming from non-state actors, whether they're militants or quote-unquote terrorists, or whether global corporations, or whether it came from historically from like religion or other ways in which this order has been impacted, or the order replaced a particular order.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to go deeper into this to understand where we are. But naturally, we're going through a shift at this point in time.
Absolutely. Sikander, I know you study China and especially its legal perspectives on a number of issues. Do we feel that the traditional underwriters of the global rules-based order, as we've seen it after the Second World War, the West, Western democracies really, their withdrawal or their abdication of their role, do you feel China stepping in and taking on more of a position in shaping international law?
Sure, and I think we need to be a bit critical of this Western order. We were so comfortable with it being a rule-based order. I mean, there have always been criticism or critiques of this order, from coming within the West, right? You've had different realist approach to international law, this institutionalist approach to international law, this incentive-based approach of rational choice theory. Countries act in their own interests. So, and of course, the criticism of this order coming from, the global South and non-Western countries. So, in that way, if this order is evolving, China does have a very special role, considering that it's a post-colonial state. It's now a very powerful, it's a superpower. and again it might be affected by these the same incentives or the same dynamics of power that led the West to act in certain ways. I mean, we can't discount those reasons there as well. Like China might just act in similar, or at times, different also, but also in a similar way as, let's say, countries like the West have done. Mm-hmm. But there is a difference, I think, and the difference is that they are not a colonial, pre-colonial or a metropolitan state that, and again driven, and we've seen the impact of that kind of colonialism. And now you see a form of what others even in the US are saying, imperialism coming from the US. So you would expect China to play more, but I think their approach, it's a very, I think it's a guarded way of how China is acting right now. I think they know they're nearly there, but they're not there. So I think if they are, their mode of operandi has been more focused on the economic sort of ways of being more influential. But they have a lot of barriers to overcome.
Absolutely.
Because those power structures, those economic, those financial power structures are still driven by the West.
Yeah. Looking at where we've seen particular things, if we come back to the issue of Greenland, right? Mm-hmm. We've seen in Congress there's a law being being pushed by Fine, which is I think it's titled the Greenland Annexation and Statehood Act in the US. Now I doubt that that's going to fly. I doubt that that's going to get passed anytime soon. But the mere fact that this regime can make threats like that and can talk about annexing territory of an ally, a NATO ally. What are your views on that?
I mean, it shows that there's also something happening behind the scenes, right? I mean, we see that President Trump acting in certain, making certain statements, assertions, and acting on them at times, and then not acting in maybe like in the context of Palestine. We saw that he talked about even like displacing the population, which is crimes against humanity, and definitely, like even genocide. Yeah. But then he steps back and he says, okay, we will develop this area. And now there's a coalition of powers. And so it shows that it's not what he says and gets away with. I mean, recently he said that, international law is dependent on how I perceive it, my morality, right?
Exactly.
I think in a way it also shows the fragmentation of the West, because you see, the Western NATO powers, particularly West, like France, Germany, and the UK helpless, and at times now even trying to say that they might take a position on this. I think the arguments to occupy Greenland are pretextual; they're not real. The US has bases there. They're Russia and China nowhere there. And in fact, he's engaging with Russia and China more than he is with the very numerous Western powers.
His own allies.
Yeah, exactly. So. I personally think that, he's a businessman at a particular level, but we, again, cannot discount the politics of the US, which is even domestic politics of the US, which is very alarming, where you see a form of reaction to President Obama and these, the last decades of, Bill Clinton and President Obama, and this sort of, this classical idea of a liberal order flourishing and prospering. And then you see from within the US a reaction to all of those values. Coming from, I would say the majority Caucasian population, some of them deprived of economic security, and, at least those are the arguments made. And you also have a lot of immigration issues, and, and also, views on, those liberal values of, like gender empowerment or, diversity, all are being challenged. So it's not just specific to international law. Whether this is going to create another reaction once this government changes. But I think populism in the US and the Republican Party becoming extremely right-wing in light of it's just the way politics is working in the US.
And isolationist, frankly, because we're seeing, withdrawal from 66 international organizations. Even perhaps there might be a collapse of NATO, given, the Greenland situation. So really, I think that's where the Republican Party seems to be heading, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, they're becoming very extreme. And I don't think that the US was not isolationist earlier as well. I mean, during World Wars earlier they were, and then they kind of take this role to. I mean, that's one reason why the league fails, right? I mean,
that's true.
but the thing is, with them being, you can't live at this point in time. The global order seems to cannot be. They can't seem to be. They're not comfortable with them, but they're not comfortable without them also, because the whole system, the whole economic, monetary system, the financial system, and also the security framework we have in place has been structured by them. And that vacuum can't be, even I think China and all these countries that are invested in the US, they wouldn't want it to completely fail right away. They want there to be some kind of space where they can fill that vacuum in, right? But I think it is a really, I mean, in a way, I mean, this could materialize. I mean, think about it. If, like, say, the US goes in and basically occupies Greenland and then says, well, and then there's going to be some discussion about it. But I think it'll happen if the US wants it to happen. I mean, what can happen subsequently is maybe some further fragmentation in the West. But I think it's a real, there's a real threat,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I really feel that would be a collapse of NATO because, and maybe, a different form of alliances.
But my question to you would be then, is that really a bad thing that the NATO collapses? Because, again, coming from, someone coming from the global south would argue that at times that organization as well as, Western powers, and they've been shown up to an extent right now, have not been loyal to their own values and the order that they project, right? In a way, this makes this more a realist framework where countries, there are multiple, I would say, centers of power in the global order, and then you have some kind of balance of power, within the global order, which we saw in the Cold War did have the effect of limiting countries to being more less aggressive with the use of force, right? Maybe you have, you could argue a safer world in some ways, right? It's hard to say at this point in time, but definitely this would be a collapse of the liberal order. That I can,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Right.
Sikander, I wanted to slightly change the topic. I mean, it's roughly the same, but looking at, President Trump announced the new Gaza board that he envisages. Now, this sort of framework has been backed by the UN Security Council as well, and everything. But it's been rejected by Israel, which is surprising because a lot of the people on that board are very pro-Israel, if you will. And interestingly enough, I think Trump has imposed a $1 billion price tag on states that want to be part of this. Now, you and I don't have $1 billion, so we probably can't be members of it. But I'm sure there are many, Arab
billionaires out there,
billionaire nations out there, certainly that can be part of it. And Pakistan's apparently been invited to be part of this thing. Now, what capacity? I'm not exactly sure, but it's interesting. What are your views on this?
I see the fact that it's problematic, really, because you're corporatizing international law at some level.
Exactly.
And then, you put basically, and I'm not very comfortable with the kind of people who are on that board, like, I think Tony Blair's
he's
on that board, and there's a checkered history when it comes to the war in Iraq. So I don't see these people actually, but I think to an extent why Israel might have a problem is because they might want to have their cake and eat it too, and that's not going to happen now for them, at least, because even if you have others on that board, like the Hakan Fidan, like the Turkish Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and others, so there would be some pushback in terms of how this would unfold, because you're looking at a huge, massive project to construct, and other issues like there's some issues of like how would water be shared between Israel and Palestine, electricity. I mean, all of these functions are being performed by certain bodies. Some of those bodies are extremely fragile now, or been I would say effectively destroyed by Israel, like the UN UNRWA organization operating there. So I think this is, I find it problematic because I see it kind of imperial also, like, certain powerful nations, Western nations having disproportionate representation on this board, and also the corporate segmentation here, how are decisions to be made based on what are going to be the parameters. But I think a lot of Muslim countries have accepted it, and I would when it comes to Pakistan, I'm concerned more so because I don't think there's any domestic assessments that are being made, and also ownership by our own people. We are a democracy.
I mean, there's no real debate on this, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's no public debate. There's no public assessments. How it affects our foreign affairs, foreign relations. We face our own challenges, both from, a lot of them are like, challenges from within the neighborhood, like, hostile neighbors of, India, Afghanistan. And also, even, countries like Iran and all that are right now in a active confrontation with those same actors.
Absolutely.
So I would think we should have been more inclusive in our assessments internally before we would make these these kind of. Surely if we've been invited, there's been some interest shown by us, and also there have been public statements to the effect that we want to be part of this initiative.
Absolutely. And Sikander, we're in a place right now where some of the most important issues of our lifetime perhaps require the international community to come together. Look at climate change. Look at new forms of weaponry, artificial intelligence, and the regulation needs to take place at the international stage. But we're seeing a fragmentation, as we've discussed. What do you see? How do you see the regulation of, say, some of these issues at the international level happening? Are we not going to see international treaties anymore, or are they going to be watered down? What are your views?
That's a very complicated question. I think a lot of this is anyways being driven by these newer sort of challenges or the regulation or the lack of it is now being driven by a lot of big corporations. I mean, AI is effectively controlled in the US by a couple of corporations, and they are driving not just innovation but legal reform, if there is any, and the kind of investment going in these areas,
trillions,
and how that investment is the incentives created through that investment in affecting us and the global order. I don't think any of this, kind of like this invisible hand kind of functioning once those investments are made. I know that in this regard, I was talking to some other experts that China has done a more regulated and more, I would say more diligent and a more structured exercise when it comes to, because they have been also at the forefront of AI development, but their research and their investments are more driven by more thinking going into that sort of initiative. It's just not like. So, and hence they're starting from bottoms up in a way, because they're kind of moving up. Whereas in the West or in the US particularly, it's kind of like happening at the top and then filtering down. Mm-hmm. So the effects of AI on how it affects global economy, on how it affects security, all of those things are still it's uncharted. But I think I would be more comfortable with countries that are doing their due diligence when it comes to that. But to answer your question, whether when you have corporations driving AI development, and we'll talk about environment in a second. I was at a conference in Warsaw a couple of years ago, and it was sort of sponsored by the West on digital rights and digital freedoms. Absolutely. And it was completely boycotted by these big organizations because they didn't want even the kind of liberal regulation, which is very limited, because it was driven by the West on their activities. Wow. So, and they're, huge companies that we all know of. Mm-hmm. So I think when it comes to climate, there's a lot of research to suggest in any case that, I think there's been a global failure when it comes to the environment and how the US kind of pulls out of this whole framework. But again, I think China is playing a bigger role in this. But the problem with the environment again is that, having talked to some experts, the human lacks the ability to think beyond a certain amount of generations. When it comes to, they don't discount the value of loss subsequently following. So that's always going to be a harder topic. But I don't know really. I think that President Trump, if the US government changes, in the coming elections, then you might have a huge rebound, and then a lot of these actors might come back and could be kind of like we have with the environment. If you look at certain environmental engagements or treaties, you see that when bigger countries haven't stepped up, smaller countries do, or mid-sized countries do, or the global south does, and eventually they kind of join in. But other times they don't. So it's hard to say how this will unfold.
Yeah.
But in the end, I don't see that the multilateral order in the next 4 or 5 years doing well.
Okay.
You might have still treaties, you might have agreements, but there might be more in the nature of a few countries coming together to look out for their own
regional
regional arrangements. Right?
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you more about middle powers like Pakistan. How do we navigate this fragmented, new world that we're seeing right now?
Well, some people would say that we're doing a good job. Because look at Pakistan. With a bigger country but smaller economy, at least the economy, which is the documented economy, right? But our relations with China are good, our relations with the US are good, our relations with being being good enough that we've basically a lot of criticism coming from countries like India and other countries that have historically been, or Israel, for example, closer in the last decade or so, being closer to the US, seeing them as a natural ally. So you could say that as far as Pakistan, but the problem with that approach is that it kind of puts Pakistan in this role of always trying to maneuver global politics, right?
Yeah.
And I think from our perspective, something that I firmly believe, that a rule-based order based on our size and our concerns, the incentives for us should be to promote this order, because we face a bigger enemy, as we perceive traditionally, and as a consequence, whether it's still better to have that order than to not have that order.
Absolutely.
Whether it's on issues like, all our threats are from outside, in a sense that we don't aggressively use force. Till recently. With our neighbors, we're always kind of like responding. They have arguments. So whether it's Afghanistan or whether it's India. So for us, and we want to like protect our own border. That's like external sovereignty, I think it affects. But also all like being a low riparian state when it comes to Indus water, climate. These are all issues that puts us in a position where we would want a global multilateral rule-based order to prosper. Considering climate as one example, we can't independently deal with climate.
That's
a lot of the climate disasters we are facing are because we're one of the most climatically affected country out there. Also, when it comes to public health, again, these are things that can't be sorted out by ourselves, right?
Yeah.
We need a global system to be plugged into that global system, whether it's polio, whether it's infectious diseases, whether it's
the next COVID.
Yeah, exactly. All those things, and it's we also are a younger population. So as a younger population, we should be, we should look forward to the future, because we have an average age of less than 21, I think. So in a country which is going to grow and become big, I think they want to promote a global order, because that order would be good for not just the country but for the people, and sometimes people who are migrating or who are who are basically immigrating because of the kind of the what do you say, the money they send back, really, right? The remittances. We want to promote an order where we as a country are part of the system, we grow, because currently we rank really low when it comes to you must have seen passport rankings and all, because of all those reasons that it's very hard for Pakistanis to travel outside the country. And you do have a lot of potential when it comes to labor, and even specialized labor like doctors, engineers. And so I think it makes sense for us to be part of these arrangements. So we should promote those arrangements.
Absolutely. And final question, just before I let you go, what do you think are the key areas of growth for international law? Where do you think the few avenues that you foresee?
It depends, really. It depends on what way. It depends on the question would be what is going to happen, or what is good for us as a country in the global south.
Well, maybe
right?
both. So whatever your take is on that.
I think also it's important to look at the kind of challenges to international law. One thing is, I mean, the example I can come up with is that of like what happened in Venezuela, there where you have the U.S. going in, bringing about regime change in a second, and then going back, and then there's a lot of oil reserves in Venezuela, and there's even from within the U.S. there's a discussion of this being a form of imperialism, that ownership of natural resources, whereas the U.S. didn't do that in Iran, for example. Yeah. And I'll answer your question, but I want to give you some context here. And basically, you have at least the experts are discussing this, because Iran started off, it's an ideological state, and as a consequence, removing one or two people is not going to remove the system, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, irrespective, and I don't have an opinion on whether the state of Iran has, there's a lot of talk of human rights violations and suppression of political rights, but they face genuine sovereignty challenges. Is that shows that they did have a system in place where institutions matter, right? So coming back to your point, I think where international law can be strengthened is where you have international institutions be more robust, but also more inclusive, right? Okay, I mean, so you're looking at, maybe as you're pointing out, China playing that role, or the global south playing a role that we haven't, like we need, or even Islamic countries coming together and empowering their own institutions, or certain institutions. They could empower their own institutions as well, because in this whole Israel-Palestine war, you could see that the OIC has really not been a powerful organization, even though looking in terms of population, in terms of resources, military might, they're a pretty powerful bloc, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think it's important that we develop institutions, whether we're looking at local institutions before in regional institutions to international institutions, and we, because otherwise it's basically self-interest, and even that in a way develops its own framework, right? If your country is self-interested, it realizes that it's in their own self-interest to obey international law. The US again will, in the larger context, in the larger scheme of things, this is part of some kind of a reaction to what they, the global order, and from within the US because of domestic politics, right?
Yeah.
How globalization, or even though they are the ones driving it, has affected certain stakeholders within the US, right? But in a way, it could be a natural trajectory. And I think if you look at international, some people, there's a firm belief in a lot of places, particularly Pakistan, like mid-sized countries, that there is international law can only and always will be explained by the realist approach, like might is right. But again, there are alternatives, like this institutional order, like, you have organizations like the WHO, and like, how AIDS was dealt with, for example, through the UN framework, where basically it's been eradicated, is that institutions, when they are strengthened, do work, right? Maybe they have to be more inclusive. Maybe other countries that haven't been part of those institutions, even in the UN context, this is a concern of inclusivity. The UN Security Council is not inclusive.
At all, no, absolutely.
So I think that even a Hobbesian way of looking at this is that when you have, if your own interest, you're always at war, you kind of come together. And a lot of Western scholars have said that you need to respect international organizations. On the other, for example, Kant talks about this and says, irrespective of whether you might not, you have your own order and it's a higher order, you still have to respect non-Western orders for things like private international trade. And he's seen as a forefather for, private international trade law, which is not governed by, like public international law is, by definition, by a state-based order. So, in any case, there are institutions there, whether they're going to be more public or private. But I think from our perspective, we need to strengthen our own institutions, whether it's SARC, which never got, really going, or whether it's other alternatives like, the BRICS, or, and I think Pakistan needs to be on the right side of history, which they have historically been on a lot of international. I think at times we made mistakes, but as a whole, we've been a country that has sided on the right side when it came to these foreign relations and other kind of issues on rights and social rights, legal rights, political rights, rights of people, self-determination. We've always taken the right position. So I think it's important for Pakistan to be on the right side of history, rather than what I'm seeing right now, that they're trying to extract some kind of short-term benefit.
Sikander, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking out the time. That brings us to the end of the first episode of Legally Speaking. Thank you for watching. I'm Oves Anwar, and I'll see you next time when we'll once again be Legally Speaking.